SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
My name is Devojit Kumar Sharma. I will be taking up this lecture on the topic of perspective in corrections as part of the course on criminology, penology and victimology. Now, this word correction may be somewhat new to you. What usually people come across the terminologies such as reformation, rehabilitation, reintegration and so on and so forth. But what is this correction all about? Why it is called correction? And how corrections as the objective of punishment have been influenced from time to time by different philosophers and thinkers over the period of time. We have already discussed on the schools of criminology, on the theory of sentencing, and today in this particular lecture into the various perspective or approaches that we can looking at correction. Friends, appreciate the fact that imprisonment, be it community service, any other form or variety of punishment, every such punishment aims at one important outcome, that is how do you correct the person who has been, I would say, influenced by different conditions or different situations to commit crime. How do you bring about a positive change in the person who happened to commit a particular crime? Now, that positive change is nothing but what in simple terms can be called as corrections. Now, how do you see the positive change? Is it something that we give the person sufficient means of survival, then the person can be said to have been corrected, or we help the person or support the person to live in the community, the person can be said to have been corrected? The answer may not be in affirmative in all situations. The corrections in the true sense of the term means and implies that a kind of self discovery, the kind of realization that whatever wrong that person has committed, that wrong he or she would never commit again, and the person becomes altogether a different person person afterwards. That means, the way an offender after being released from the prison or after undergoing a quantum of sentence would like to see himself or herself in the mainstream society is something what the correction aims at. I would like to inform you about a story. It is from Japan, which is very famous for the very system of community provision, where they are community volunteers in the whole system of probation, which they have been, these volunteers have been statutorily recognized under a definite statute in Japan. Now, the story behind enactment of that law or statute which recognizes voluntary probation officers is somewhat very interesting. It so happened that a person who was undergoing prison for 10 long years was influenced by one of the prison personnel in a jail in Japan, and he was so influenced that at the time of leaving the prison, he promised to the prison personnel, and who happened to be a deputy prison warden, that he would never commit any wrong in future once he is being released from the prison. This prisoner spent altogether 10 years in that prison, and afterwards when he went back to his family and went back to his society, he found that his wife got remarried with 3 children. His relatives were not willing to accept him because of his past record, that is, he had spent already 10 years inside the jail. There is already a stigmatic kind of perception that the relatives have against him. Moreover, the police also refused to arrest him without any reason, but he was determined not to commit any crime, as he promised to the prison personnel who happened to be the deputy prison warden. Now, it so happened the person was completely helpless. He did not know what to do, where to go, because there was no one who perhaps accepted him, and there is no place where he could go after being released from the jail. Now, it so happened that this ex-prisoner, because of such situations, committed suicide, and before committing suicide, he wrote a letter to the deputy prison warden, who influenced him to a great extent what has happened to him after being released from the prison. This particular incident was instrumental for the setting of the voluntary probation system in Japan. And why I am narrating this story to you? Because of the fact that that is what the correction should aim at. It is a very holistic process which should take into account not only the kind of self realization on the part of the offender, but also to create situations and circumstances where such people or such ex offenders can can come out of their past antecedent or the past history, and they can more in a better way they can mainstream, or they can relate with the society at large, and they can make themselves more comfortable as a part of the larger society. Now, this is one story. There would be hundreds of such stories which directly or indirectly influences upon the correctional practices, how it should be. This is one of the perspectives that I wanted to inform you, that the need and relevance of what we call as community corrections. Now, usually when we say punishment, the immediate thing which comes into our mind is the jail, but the question remains, is the jail or the prison the only way to punish someone? The answer may be no. Does physical structures, that is if somebody is being confined to a jail or prison, that may not always be the correctional strategy to be called as appropriate one for the purpose of all the people, all the offenders who might commit crime. There could be other strategies also for the better reformation, reintegration of people who have been, I would call them as infected by a disease called crime. And that is the story, that is all about correction. In fact, when we mention about correctional administration in the country like India, which not only includes systems such as juvenile justice, systems such as probation, systems such as parole, but also it includes invariably institutions such as jail. Now, there is a difference between these two kinds of institutions. One is a very close institution, that is the jail or the prison, and the other is the more of a community based or community centric kind of community centric setup, where offenders are allowed to live with the family in the community, so that they can better integrate, so that they get more opportunity to integrate back to the society, and society also get an opportunity to know about them more closely. Now, the story that I narrated to you, the problem what lied in that was that though he was or he became a reformed person, he was determined not to commit a crime, but then society was not willing to accept him. Now, is that the very goal or the objective of correction? The answer is no. There is a much wider objective, there is a much wider goal of correction, where all the stakeholders need to come together to find a particular solution to the problems of crime and deviance in the society. Now, the way corrections have been looked into from time to time is very interesting altogether. Initially, it was the very relation between religion and punishment which can be noticed, that is the philosophy which prevailed was the Quakers' philosophy of 17th century. Now, this Quakers' philosophy is rooted in religion, and more particularly in the Quakers movement, formerly called as the Society of Friends, founded by George Fox in 1650s in England. And two important persons or propounders of this Quakers' philosophy were John Bellers and William Penn. And they were the ones who for the first time called the prisons as the house of corrections. What John Baylor believed was that the offenders were nothing but the creation of an unfair society. So therefore, the society should take responsibility for well-being of such persons once they are released from the prison. That was the thinking of John Baylor. Then the another thinker or the propagator of this Quakers' philosophy happens to be William Penn, who said that the prisoners should be taught a trade or a kind of a livelihood, so that once they are released from the prison, they may be able to better manage their life and livelihood. Now, when we discuss about the Quakers' philosophy, it is important for us to also recognize the context in which the Quakers' philosophy emerged. They primarily aimed at adopting more of a kinder and human approach to such people who were inside the jail or who were put in prison. Now, the situation at that point of time when this philosophy emerged was that the interaction with the prisoners by anyone outside the prison was completely prohibited. In fact, when the prisoners used to come out of their cells, they were covered with a cloth, black cloth in their faces, so that neither they could interact, others could interact with them. And such people who were in the jail were put into solitary confinement. These were kind of solitary cells in the jail with no any outlet, or there was no any scope for anyone either entering into or for them to go out of the cells. Even the food was supplied to them in a very in a manner which could not be seen by the others, and prisoners were rather referred to as numbers. However, the Quakers were determined to do something about those prisons, and they in fact wanted to reform the conditions which prevail at that point of time, at the point of time, and they were in fact very dismayed with the fact that 30 to 90 inmates were put together in one large room, and what they did was they advocated for separating such prisoners. Say for instance, we have now the provision of separating the hardened criminals from the petty offenders, then man from the women. These were the things that the Quakers movement they started propagating, or they started advocating for. Now, in the year 1829, Quakers opened a famous prison in Philadelphia that housed prisoners in strict solitary confinement, which were better than the small inhuman cells which prevailed at that point of time. Now, there was another person associated with this movement, Quakers movement. He happens to be Dr. Benjamin Rush. He was so much opposed to the idea of inhuman treatment, or to which was prevailing at that point of time, and to humiliate a prisoner while imposing hard labor. And the prisoners were even deprived of food at times, sleep and other necessities. Now, these were the existing conditions against which the the Quakers they raised their voice. Now, there came the very important parameter that we need to take notice of is that this Quakers philosophy, or the Quakers movement, was in fact, the ideas were in fact based on something called the Great Law, and which was nothing but a statutory laws which was enacted by the legislature at Pennsylvania in 1682 under William Penn's supervision. What is the Great Law all about? As I have already indicated to you, this is more of a kind and human approach towards people who have been infected with the disease of crime, and this is something they propagated because they wanted the Almighty, or they wanted the very fact that there should be mercy to the people. It may be because of the fact that the people who committed crime might not be aware of the reasons, or even if they might have been aware of the reasons of committing crime, there is every reason to believe that these people can be reformed, and it is the Almighty or the God who could at least be more merciful towards them. This is a kinder, more human approach is well reflected in the Great Law, where law and religion intervene. The Great Law is brimming with the idea that offenders can be redeemed by the Lord, and it is the first instance of a law which uses the term house of corrections to refer to prisons. So, what we can find here is that for the first time the prisons came to be called as the house of corrections as part of this Quakers movement, or being influenced by the Quakers philosophy. At that point of time, when the Quakers philosophy was prevalent or had its influence in America and Europe, two influential thinkers you may be well aware about. In France, Charles Montesquieu and Francis Voltaire had made seminal contribution in the field of corrections. Though it may so happen that these thinkers might not have used the terminology as corrections, but then somewhere one can find the influence of their thinking in the whole evolution or the history of corrections as a whole. The work of Montesquieu, that is the Spirit of Laws, discuss about something called as punishment scale, which is similar to the modern idea of the proportionality of the punishment. That means, punishment cannot be same for all offenses. There should be distinction based on the person who commits the crime, based on the antecedent and the precedent of the person. That is something that finds mention in the Spirit of Laws, where Montesquieu discussed the punishment scale, in which punishment were to be made proportional to the severity of the crime. That means, something which needed to be looked into is the severity of the crime, not that the same punishment can be given to one and all. Whereas, at that point of time, the existing penal laws prescribe same punishment for all offences irrespective of kind and variety. As I have already told you, even Montesquieu did not talk about corrections directly. Rather, he mentioned about more milder form of punishment such as fines and shames that could have a important bearing on the person who was to be corrected or who was to be reformed. Alongside Montesquieu, there was another thinker called Voltaire, as I have already mentioned. This thinker opposed harsh punishment like mutilation and death penalty, and instead of that, what he advocated was leaving lessons to prisoners and utilizing their labor in public works. That means, how do we bring about a more significant change, because the mutilation and the death penalty may not be the answer in every situation for every person for the purpose. Now, in his own words, the torments of criminals be useful, a hangman is good for nothing, but a man condemned to public work still serves his country as a living lesson. That means, it is something similar to the community service that we are talking about as part of the new criminal law in India, that prisoners' efforts or the work should be utilized for the public work, for the community service, something similar to that. Now, Voltaire did not talk for correcting prisoners directly, rather he advocated for, or he rather mentioned that the idea of giving a living lesson to prisoners and using their labor in public work contain the prototype idea of correction. That means, it is nothing but a way of looking at correction, and it is very important perspective towards correction so far as the Voltaire philosophy goes. Now, after we have discussed about the Quakers' philosophy, then the Montesquieu and Voltaire, then came the classical criminology. As you already know that we have discussed as part of our discussion on, as part of our lecture in schools of criminology and theories of crime, that the classical theory, which was propounded by Beccaria and Bentham, also to a great extent influence over the punishment aspect or the sentencing aspect or sentencing practices which were prevalent at that point of time. The proportionality of punishment as per gravity of the crime, which was talked about by Beccaria, and an idea which is quite similar to Montesquieu and Voltaire, is an aspect which needs to be given kind of notice here. And this, the very proportionality of the punishment to the gravity of the crime or the offense, is something which find mention in Beccaria's work, that is an essay on crimes and punishment. As I have already told you, his works and his philosophy was so radical at his time that Roman Catholic Church even condemned his book in 1766, and his book was placed in the church box of forbidden books. That was what the Beccaria had to face. As you may be already aware of the fact that when the classical school started influencing over the society, at that point of time the context was the spiritualistic understanding, that is the pre-classical ideas. Who was believed that anybody committing crime was under the influence of some devil and evil tendencies. So, the best way or the best solution was to eliminate such people. I mentioned to you regarding the practice of witch hunting, which is still prevalent in certain regions of the country in India. Similarly, during the pre-classical time, such people who committed wrong or crime were believed to be witches or similar to such kinds, and therefore, the most barbaric and inhuman punishment was given to such criminals or people who offended the societal sentiments. Now, in chapter 6 of his work, Beccaria advocated that punishment is effective only when there is a proportionality between the crime and punishment, and he wrote in this context, and I quote, "It is not only the common interest of mankind that crimes should not be committed, but that crimes of every kind should be less frequent in proportion to the evil they produce to society. Therefore, the means made use of by the legislature to prevent crime should be more powerful in proportion as they are destructive of the public safety and happiness, and as the inducement to commit them are stronger." That is what he talked about punishment. That is what he thought about the very proportionality of the punishment as per the gravity of the offense. Similarly, he further wrote that the end of punishment therefore is no other than to prevent others from committing the like offense. That is what the objective of punishment he had in mind. Such punishment therefore, and such a mode of inflicting them ought to be chosen as will make strongest and most lasting impression on the minds of others with the least torment to the body of the criminal. That means, what Beccaria advocated was more of a deterrent perspective to corrections. Now, we can infer from here is that even deterrence is important in society, and deterrent in fact remains one of the theories of punishment also, alongside retribution, reformation, rehabilitation, and so on and so forth. Now, you may be wondering, where is the correction coming in the Beccaria's writing? Yes, Beccaria never talked about correction directly, but he does, or he did in fact advocate for the idea that punishment should be mild and should not be unnecessarily inflicted. During our discussions in the schools of criminology and the theories of crime, we have found that Beccaria advocated for proportionality. It should neither be less nor be more. That means, the same punishment cannot be given to every kind of crime. That is what Montesquieu and Voltaire advocated for, even Beccaria for that matter accepted. He was having the same kind of ideological standpoint. The idea is that if such an approach or perspective is taken, then it is easier for the society to prevent crimes. Another important person associated with the classical school of criminology was Bentham, as we have already discussed about him. Now, Bentham developed this very theory, or we can say that principle of hedonistic calculus of pleasure and pain, and he defined punishment as a particular form of pain. That means, what he believed in was that the person commit crime because he or she derives pleasure out of it, and punishment should be given to the person, so that the pleasure he derives out of committing crime is outweighed by the punishment, the pain of punishment inflicting on him. Now, he talked about the fact that punishment should be in the form of imprisonment. That is again another perspective that you can see here. Furthermore, what Bentham stated was that imprisonment should be in a panopticon penitentiary, which is characterized by maximum supervision of prisoners with minimum supervision or minimum presence of prison guards. Now, why he said that? That means it has to be in a structured way, imprisonment. Why is it that there should be maximum supervision of the prisoners with minimum presence or the availability of the prison guard, so that the people who are in the jail or the prison, they have more space to reflect on their past conduct. They have more time to introspect about their past life. In a way, it is also correction, because it helps us or it helps the prisoners to reinvent. If they are being put in a structure, in a kind of confinement, in a solitary confinement, there is no scope, there is no space for them to understand themselves, because all the time they would be monitored by certain prison personnel or prison guards, which may not be conducive for them to understand themselves. So, what he advocated for very interestingly, that there should be no fear of being constantly watched by the prison guards. This is something very interesting and important, so far as correction is concerned, and that was advocated by Bentham, who is also a classical criminologist. Now, after this, we find a change in the philosophy to correction to retribution, with the work or with the contribution of Kant, who was an Enlightenment thinker from Germany. Thinker called Kant, he gave the famous theory of categorical imperative, in which he held that punishment is a positive obligation of the state and must be meted out irrespective of the consequences. That means, it should be given and it is an obligation on the part of the state for the purpose of maintaining social control or for the purpose of peaceful living of persons or the living beings in the society. Now, that is what I have mentioned, that there was a philosophical shift from correction to retribution with the work or with the with the thinking of Kant, and this is evident from his work as he opposed the ideas of Beccaria for that purpose. Now, retribution, as you may be aware that it is like for like. If the offender has done something wrong, the offender should be given punishment accordingly, and that is the rightful effect. The rightful effect, this punishment, is the answer to any crime being committed by any person for that matter. In that way, retribution respects and fulfills the offender's autonomous choice, and it is a kind of positive obligation, that what Kant advocated about on the part of the state too. Now, there came another thinker called Michel Foucault. Very interestingly, it was somewhere around 1975, and his celebrated work called Discipline and Punish the Birth of the Prison. He discussed about several important premises in relation to punishment. Now, what Michel Foucault emphasized was on the aspect of the torture and punishment. That means, he wanted to see punishment as somewhat different from physical torture which was prevalent at that point of time. Now, what was prevalent more precisely was the public execution in the earlier days, and what prevails today is the punishment in the modern sense of the term. To Michael Foucault, the manner in which he conceptualized it is like this: the punishment entails a different meaning altogether to the body relation, and in case of torture there is no meaning as such. Torture to the body is no longer the constituent element of penalty. That means only by physical way of detaining or torturing a person the objective of correction may not be achievable. There are different ways of treating a prisoner. It may be with the help of education, it may be with the help of psychological intervention, it may be with the help of other human intervention other than physical torture, which may not be the answer to every prisoner committing every kind of offense for all the time. Now, in a chapter on generalized punishment in his work, that is the discipline and punish the birth of the prison, the Michael Foucault further mentions about the very essence of punishment, targeting man in the criminal as the ultimate aim of any penal intervention. The humanity inside any person or any human being, that includes criminal being, should be respected. That means here that Michael Foucault look at correction more in the line of the human intervention rather than the physical intervention. He said the very humanity or the human being inside the criminal needs to be intervened, needs to be kind of given adequate treatment rather than physical restraint or physical torture alone, which will not or which does not serve the purpose of correction in all situations. Now, Michael Foucault took exceptions to the reformers such as Beccaria and others, as they did not give definite meaning to the penal principle. That means, how the punishment should be devised. That is something aspect that to Michael Foucault many of the earlier thinkers they ignored altogether. Now, his criticisms were further directed to the fact that in case of criminal justice practices or in case of penal sanctions, there is also an aspect of bad economy of power which is related or which is connected, which is in fact vested with the entire system of lower jurisdiction, which include police, prosecution, judges and prison officials. That means, these criminal justice functionaries is invariably under the influence of the state. They are nothing but the state entities. Now, in such a situation, there is an aspect of political economy of power which is involved, and that is something Michael Foucault indirectly talked about. So, the new economy of the power to punish when distribution will not be concentrating in the privileged points, not to divided between opposing authorities, but fairly divided among homogeneous circuits down to the finest grain of human body, is something that Michael Foucault talked about. That means, these aspects of such penal institutions should also be taken into account if we talk about correctional or corrective penalty, so far as Michael Foucault's philosophy is concerned. And what he advocated was, rather than adopting coercive measures, it is important that the training of the person or the training of the behavior of the person or the human being inside the offender should happen, which will go in a long way in the entire system of correction or correctional administration. Now, for Michael Foucault, the structures which Bentham talked about, that penitentiary only produces docile bodies, and therefore, what he emphasized was, as I have already informed to you, more of a corrective penalty which should be directed more towards the body and soul, and we should aim towards training of behavior rather than physical restraint. Now, with this kind of philosophies, which we can say that influence the institutional corrections, because you can see here that starting from Quaker's philosophy to the classicalist, then Montesquieu and Voltaire, even Michael Foucault for that purpose, they all concentrated on one thing, that is the institutional based corrections. But when we talk about corrections, there is more to it than the institutional correction and what we call a community based corrections. In fact, we have systems in place like parole, probation, which are more of the community centric punishment or community based corrections. Now, let us see where from this whole idea of community correction came and how these community corrections have been able to mainstream with, or perhaps I would say integrate with, the conventional institutional based corrections. Now, a philosophical shift from institution based correction to community based correction started when a thinker called Francis Allen, he talked about rehabilitative ideal, and the rehabilitative ideal is nothing but a kind of medical model of corrections. As perhaps I already mentioned to you, that this rehabilitation, as the word goes, we often make use of this terminology such as reformation, rehabilitation, reintegration in a very in a very similar way, but which may not be the case, because the rehabilitation or rehabilitative ideal at Francis Allen talked about is based on the study of juvenile justice, probation and parole. Now, this medical model or the rehabilitative proposition that Francis Allen talked about aim towards individual intervention with persons who have committed offences. But nevertheless, what also bears mention here is that Allen was equally concerned with the critical questions of power being exercised by criminal justice functionaries, so far as the civil liberties and other political rights are concerned. He was equally concerned about that. That is what our earlier discussion or earlier thinker talked about, the power equation, because all these functionaries are invariably drawing their legitimacy, or they are being empowered by the state. And to him, this rehabilitative ideal fails to address those concerns, but it to some extent or to a large extent, it can very successfully rehabilitate people with the individual intervention, with a kind of medical kind of intervention with such people. Now, thereafter came another thinker or another writer, what we find mentioned is Edgardo Rothman, rather I would call him an author, in his paper on Do Criminal Offenders Have a Constitutional Right to Rehabilitation, where he talks about two models of rehabilitation. One is very authoritarian and the other is humanistic and liberty centered. What is that authoritarian? That means authoritarian is the one where it is the state or the prison personnel who decide or who define what is the best correction or what is the best way to address or to deal with a particular prisoner in the prison or the jail. In this model, the inmate or the prisoner does not have any choice over the correction that he would like to adopt to, or the kind of person he would like to become after being released from the jail or the prison. And he or she, the prisoner, is bound to accept whatever has been dictated or whatever has been told to him by the prison personnel or the institution, because there is the question of institutional discipline involved in that. Most of the jails in the world at large, even today in India also, we go or we are governed by that kind of a authoritarian model, where it is the jail officials or the kind of statutes that we have governing the jails that decide what kind of corrections our prisoners would like to adopt or what is best for them. However, in the second model, this author talks about an enabling environment in which the offender may feel a sense of self discovery. Now, this kind of realization can happen, this kind of environment can happen only where the dignity of the prisoners is respected, there is proper education, therapy and non-destructive prison environment. This is something that is being recognized by this model. Even prison inmates have some of the rights which are fundamental importance in generating a sense of self-worth and trust among themselves. So, the moment we start giving such rights to the prisoner, that is from where we can say the rights of the prisoners, the moment that the kind of nowadays we talk about the prisoner's right, somewhere you can say that it started from that point of reference. It can be said, it may not be the case in every kind of prison reform movement, or it may not be the case in all countries. Now, what I am trying to bring to your notice here is that it has got two models, both can be said to be the institutional based. In one model in which the prisoners have a choice, and the other model where the prisoner have got no choice at all. This is again two perspectives on corrections. Now, thereafter came another author, Francis T. Collin, and in his paper on correctional rehabilitation discussed about the seminal question, does rehabilitation really work? Now, to him, the rehabilitation ideal or the rehabilitation model is basically premised on the behavioral sciences or the medical sciences used to cure physical ailments. That may not be an ideal model, and that may not work in all situations. What he has cited as reason here is that the most of the correctional or the criminal justice systems or the personnel for that matter are influenced more by their political and custodial consideration rather than the treatment or rather than the priorities of the prisoners. They have certain standards to be met so far as the prison security is concerned, so far as prison discipline is concerned. So, for them, according to the author, things such as corrections takes a back seat. So, this rehabilitation in reality does not work well in an institutional setup. Now, according to the author, this decline of rehabilitative model can be attributed to two factors. Number one, state discretionary power nourished by a declining confidence in the government. Number two, nothing works critique inspired by Robert Martinson. The first critique is based on the understanding that giving wide range of discretion in the hands of correctional personnel to cater to the individual and independent requirements of offenders may not be good enough. And second, it again shifted the debate from discretion to effectiveness of correctional services or correctional intervention. So, these were the different undercurrents which have been influencing or which have been impacting on the correctional strategies in the world at large, including India. And another author called Francis A. Allen, in his work on criminal justice, legal values and rehabilitative ideal, he also brought out another important premise here, that is the fundamental problems of administration of criminal law and criminal justice, that is the political authority as the study of criminal justice is the study of exercise of political power. So, the very politics behind or the politics of criminal justice and correctional justice something that figures prominently in the work of Francis Allen. Now, when such thinking was going on, there came another work, that is Correctional Policy, Classification of Goals Designed for Change, is one of the writings by Vincent O'Leary. He came up and another important idea, that is called reintegration, and he has said that reintegration is one of the 4 models of corrections along with reform, rehabilitation and restraint. I mean, you can also draw inferences from here that what the punishment should aim at. What is the purpose of punishment? Is the purpose of punishment only with regard to reform the offender, or is the purpose of punishment is only to rehabilitate the offender? Is the purpose of punishment is only to restrain the offender, or the purpose of punishment is largely to reintegrate the offender? Now, accordingly, the author said the 3 processes through which the people may adopt to new behavior, that is the corrections in the true sense of the term is possible through adopting 3 important methods of behavior patterns. Number 1 is correctional compliance, number 2 is correctional identification, and the third is correctional internalization. The correctional compliance relies more on being obedient to what has been instructed. It is primarily based on reward and punishment. Identification, that is correctional identification, relies on or emphasizes upon helping the offender to mature and to understand, so that inner directed influences will result in behavioral changes or other favorable changes in his behavior. Now, the third one, that is the correctional internalization, would help the person. Now, the correctional identification emphasizes upon helping the offender to mature and to understand, so that inner directed influence will result in favorable changes in his behavior. Now, based on the models of correction, the author said that the reintegration model among these 3 models attempts to reduce the stigma attached to an offender or stigma attached to a criminality, which is the real hindrance to many criminals or so far as the past criminals are concerned. And the moment we help the person to reintegrate back to the society, the point that I emphasized at the very starting of this lecture is the best way to correct. For that, it is important that we bring about some positive changes in the person. At the same time, we also create an enabling environment, so that the society readily accept the ex-offender or the ex-prisoner amidst them. Now, these were, to sum up the discussion today, these were or these are in fact some of the thinking and philosophies which are instrumental in shaping correctional strategies, in shaping correctional interventions, not only at the institutional based correctional systems, but also at the community based correctional systems. Now, what is correction and how correction needs to be perceived can be drawn or can be understood with the help of the discussion that we just now had, and this is what gives us a very holistic, I would say to some extent it gives us an idea about what correctional perspective is all about. Thank you so much.